Hello BookTube, this is Brecky from Brecky Writes. This is Brecky Reads, and this is my spoiler-free review of The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson. The Argonauts is both a sort of memoir, but also a bit of literary criticism, all wrapped up into this really interesting, almost jumbled mess. There aren't any chapters. It's written in a really interesting style of just these sections that kind of go back and forth and have a loose connection to one another. The Argonauts is both about her relationship to her partner Harry Dodge, but also about her understanding queerness and sexual identity, the fact that her partner is gender fluid and is both identifying as masculine and feminine and neither at different points in their relationship. This is also about her relationship to queerness and radicalism and its relationship to heteronormativity and homonormativity. This is also about her relationship to her mother and Harry's relationship to her mother, their mother. She does use female pronouns for her partner most of the time. And just this whole interesting conversation about being in a non-normative family and what it's like to both give birth and to be a mother, but also be an other. And it's a really interesting look at all of these different contexts and a really slim volume. This is less than 150 pages, so it's quite a fast gallop through a lot of topics. Some of the strengths of the Argonauts is that Maggie Nelson has an incredible command of language. She is a literary critic as well as a poet, and that shines through again and again. If you are someone who is looking for literature that has a real craft of language, then this would be one I would really recommend. It is just beautifully written and funny and odd, and it is not for everyone, I think, but if you are a fan of literary fiction or if you have read any literary criticism, I think you'll get a lot out of this. I also think that this is a really great read for June since it is Pride Month, and for anybody who identifies in the queer community or is interested in being a queer ally, because part of the conversation she has is what does it mean to have a queer family, since queerness is often and in many ways linked to non-normativeness, so radicalism, and if you have two lesbians together in a partnership raising children that mirrors the kind of normative relationships that heterosexual couples have, is that then still queer? And there's a lot of conversation about that. Another beautiful part of this memoir is that it charts her pregnancy with her son Iggy, and both her attempts to get pregnant and the heartbreak of not being able to get pregnant and the difficulty of that whole endeavor, and then actually being pregnant and what that is like, and that kind of invasion of the body and that kind of intimacy and what that is like for her, and then actual birth and pregnancy itself. It's done in a way that is artful. It doesn't feel grotesque or gratuitous. It is done in a way that feels honest without making it perfect and like butterflies and unicorns. It also makes it feel relevant to the conversation about sexual identity and identity in general and relationships. One of the things she said is, what is more queer than a pregnant woman, since you are so outside the norms of what most humans experience. Pregnancy is so odd because you have such an intimate contact with another being and yet you don't have contact with them. It's a really interesting argument made, like I said, in a really short book. I do have a couple of critiques, and that's going to relate into why I'm going to give it the rating I'm going to give it. The first critique is that this has a lot of very high-handed literary and linguistic criticism. If you don't have a background in literary criticism, in linguistics, or in philosophy, there are going to be whole chunks of this that are going to be hard for you. You need to go in knowing that there are going to be whole passages that you are not going to have an idea of what's going on, because she's referencing Lacan, she's referencing Wittgenstein, she's referencing a lot of literary critics that, unless you're up on the scene or you have a background in philosophy, I have a little bit of a background in philosophy, you're just not going to know what their arguments are. And it does take away from a book that has been marketed towards the general public, and that is a criticism I have, maybe more for the publisher than for Maggie Nelson herself. This was presented to me in every place that I saw it encountered as a memoir, not as a piece of literary criticism, and that is misleading. And I could see a lot of people abandoning this book or not enjoying this because there are just pages where I was like, I've read Wittgenstein, and I have read Lacan, and I have read Freud, and I still have no idea. Like, I can barely grasp the depth that she's getting at. And in that respect, I think that this would have had a better service to have had, like, footnotes of explanations for folks who are reading this because they're interested in the queer relationships in the memoir, rather than reading her because it's literary critique. Most of this was great, so I don't want to say that if you don't read literary criticism that you're not going to get anything out of it, but you should be warned going in that she uses a lot of linguistics, literary criticism, and philosophy to discuss language and the capacity for language to have meaning and the understanding of identity therein. And if you get that stuff and you already have a background, you're gonna love it. If this is your first ride, if this is your first rodeo with those sorts of concepts, it will be a challenge. My only other major criticism of this piece is that it's very jumbled. It doesn't have chapters, it moves quickly back and forth from arguments, and it doesn't have a really coherent line of thought. She'll jump back and forth between pieces, and you really do have to pay attention. Now, I read this in one sitting, and I think the fact that I read it in one sitting actually helped because I knew where all of her jumping points were, and it's short, so you could theoretically read this in one sitting. But I do think that that is a detractor, in my opinion, is the jumbledness. There are places where that jumping back and forth between 2 or 3 dialogues actually works really, really well, and I think the last 50 pages or so of the book, she seems to have found a groove where she's talking about her pregnancy and her birthing narrative and jumping into the death narrative of her partner's mother and her own thoughts about motherhood, and that seems to work. But in the beginning, where she's putting in a lot of literary criticism, and she'll jump from different literary critics, then to reflections on her past, then to a present moment with her son, it can be a little bit jumbled, and I think that does take away from some of the power of what she's saying, because you're like, okay, where in time are we? Who are we with now? Overall, I'm gonna give the Argonauts 4.5 out of 5 stars. If you have any interest in queer theory, in identity, in language, in queer parenting, in the fluctuation of identity when one is not really either male or female, and how you love in queer ways, I think The Argonauts is a great read. If you are not interested in those things, I still think you should read this because it's a beautiful story of motherhood as well, and motherhood to somebody who didn't think she would ever be a mom, and it took being in the right relationship for her to embrace that identity. This is not an easy read. This is not going to be what I would call a beach read, but it is an immensely important read, and I would highly, highly recommend it for those reasons. If you've read it, I would love to know your thoughts. Let me know how you felt about it, and if you haven't read it, let me know if you think you're gonna pick it up, because I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts, and let me know if it's something that you would be interested in. I hope you guys are doing well, and I will talk to you later. Bye!